I'd like to make 3 points too, in the interest of brevity. The first is, of course, that the situation is dramatic, and that cannot be emphasized enough. I'd like to highlight this through two indicators in particular, updated to the last year for which we have confirmed country level data, that is 2020. The first of these is the ratio of accumulated public external debt, total external debt, apologies, to export revenues. This has briefly been alluded to by Dr. Manangi, and the current figures are very concerning. They show that out of 42 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa for which this data is available, 12 countries have seen their accumulated external debt amount to close to and well above, including well above 4 times their export revenues. I repeat, 4 times their export revenues, and in some cases even 5 times that export revenue. A further 8 countries see this indicator having come close to or exceeding 3 times of the export revenues, including such diverse economies as a middle-income country like Kenya and a SID economy such as the Seychelles. In a further 5 countries, accumulated total debt stocks amounted to more than twice their export revenues, or very close to that level. And another 7 countries have seen their external debt stocks slightly above their export revenues. Only 7 countries of those 42 countries have held external or currently hold external debt stocks that are less than their export revenues. The second indicator I'd like to mention is the high and growing debt servicing costs only on public external debt to government revenue. Here we know that for a number of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, this amounts to well over 50% of government revenue. The list is led by Somalia with 96.8% of government revenue in 2020 going to the payment of external public debt. In a range of countries, this is situated between 20% and 50% of government revenues. And then there still is a long list of countries where this amounts to more than 10% of government revenues. Now, why do I mention these 2 indicators? Essentially because they are very important to get an approximative but realistic picture of countries' external debt sustainability and their public sector sustainability from a solvency perspective. So these indicators give us an idea about the solvency situation and not just about the short-term liquidity situation. Total external debt to export measures approximate the external solvency status, since export revenues in these countries are the main earner of foreign exchange. And of course, the burden that debt service payments on public external debt represent relative to government revenues provide an obvious idea of public sector solvency. In both cases, this situation today is substantially worse than at the start of the millennium, that is in 2000. In part, these 2020 figures reflect, of course, the impact of what is still the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but they do not yet include more recent developments in 2021 and 2022. These include partially improvements, for example, in export performance in the first 3 quarters of 2021 due to the initial global economic recovery from the pandemic, but they also do not include much worsening prospects since early 2022, partly due to the armed conflict in Ukraine, renewed monetary tightening cycles in advanced economies led by the US, but also increasingly in many developing countries, and they do not include what are now generally considered the rather gloomy prospects of a US and eventually global recession in 2023. In fact, as we are well aware, we now face the most serious cost of living crisis as a consequence of these interrelated factors. Second, I would like to point out that, of course, while comparisons are often made to earlier developing country debt crisis in Latin America in the 1980s and so-called East Asian financial and debt crisis in the 1990s, but also the African debt crisis of the second half of the 1990s, are relevant to an extent, but are also not entirely applicable. In the first instance, these crises were regionally focused, and at least in the former two, the Latin American crisis and the East Asian crisis, they were led by large developing country economies and therefore elicited to some extent an international policy response. By contrast, the current crisis affects countries in all income groups and across all regions, including and leadingly so, of course, Africa, but it is therefore also dispersed and to some extent does not have that kind of leadership effect in terms of eliciting a substantive international policy response. Equally important is that, of course, in the case of Africa, but also elsewhere, we see a different composition of external debt. This has already been mentioned, so I'll just very briefly recall this for completeness' sake. In the first instance, we now have, of course, a situation where Sub-Saharan African countries, including a few LICs, low-income countries, face principal and disbursement payments on sovereign bonds in 2023 and 2024 in particular in foreign currency. After this, local currency bonds become more important. This has been pointed out in other contexts before me, but it should also in this regard be remembered that there is quite widespread foreign ownership of local currency denominated sovereign bonds that continues therefore to expose these countries to foreign investment behaviors, in particular in upper middle and lower middle income countries. In the same context, of course, what is very important is the changed creditor composition, and in this context specifically, the sharp increase in private creditor participation and ownership in external debt, in particular in upper middle income countries. Private bondholders by now in Sub-Saharan Africa by now hold 75.3% of sovereign debt, and commercial banks 9.2%. In lower middle income countries, these figures are 22.7% and 13.3% respectively. As we know, in low income countries, the figures are much lower, 1.5% in terms of private bondholders of sovereign debt and 7.6% of sovereign external debt held by commercial banks. But it is very important here also to remember that while the overall share is much smaller, in low-income countries, much of this privately held debt is owed by a few very large companies, which also has implications, of course, for the relative bargaining power in negotiating this debt. Now, it is clear, and that's my third point, that the current initiatives to tackle both the structural causes and features of this external debt as well as its current dimensions are lacking in both scope and effectiveness. Something that hasn't been mentioned here so far, but that's important, is of course in this regard the G20 initiatives, the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and the Common Framework. But also multilateral policies that have focused largely on new emergency lending and lending facilities, part of which is concessional lending, but that of course constitutes new debt at specific policy conditionalities. The biggest danger right now, in our view, is that we see a return to debt treatments often partial debt treatments that resemble probably most closely the Paris Club Evian approach that refers to Paris Club approach to debt treatment for non-HIPC and non-MDRI countries. That is debt relief linked to very large and often very devastating austerity programs on the back of already limited fiscal spaces and fiscal squeezes due to the interlinked global crisis I have mentioned and others have mentioned. And of course, these initiatives do not tackle the need for lower lending costs in particular. So what is needed in terms of reform, and I would just like to insert that while I very much agree with Dr. Mangani's four propositions in principle, I think UNCTAD would probably advocate focusing on agreed, powerful and far-reaching reform strategies from the start that will entail some degree of dismantling, but to make sure that the focus is not primarily on dismantling, since that, of course, runs the danger of leaving a vacuum, or can run the danger of leaving a vacuum, and we all know who tends to fill those, namely the most powerful at the time. So dismantling should not, we think, be tackled without a clear reform strategy and reform demands in mind. Here, very briefly mentioning core areas of reform. One is something that's only been mentioned in passing, and I can imagine why, namely debt transparency. That has been the focus, of course, of much of work done at the G20 and at the Bretton Woods institutions. But we would argue that more is needed in this regard, since the situation that we have now is one that combines placing the burden on either voluntary disclosure by increasingly complex groups of lenders, as well as on independent improvements at the national level in borrower states. And that is bound to produce the kind of piecemeal results that we see. Instead, what we would advocate and consider as important, if not sufficient, is a return to treating debt transparency, and that means debtor and creditor transparency, as a public good. In particular, for example, through the establishment of a publicly accessible registry of that data for developing countries. A basis for this is provided, if I may, by the UNCTAD principles for promoting responsible sovereign borrowing and lending, as well as by the UN resolution on basic principles for sovereign debt restructuring processes of 2015 that place core emphasis on transparency. This also has received quite a bit of support by civil society organizations, as well as by, for example, the UN Financing for Development in the area of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative that ran through 2020 and 21. The point of raising this here is in particular to remember that knowledge and information is power, and that also applies to widening transparency initiatives to creditor information on sovereign debt contracts. The next steps to consider are probably some that focus on how can some immediate financial relief be brought to heavily crisis-stricken developing countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'd like to highlight two elements here. One is still ODA, official development assistance. While this has encountered, of course, criticism in particular from within Africa as being an instrument of dependency and to some extent economic neocolonialism, we would like to argue that that should not, though, stop progressive movements from first of all claiming outstanding ODA commitments that have not been fulfilled, since these run into very high million figures and even crossing the $1 trillion figure, even for Sub-Saharan Africa alone, depending on how far you go back in the first instance. But secondly, also combining this with reform of the way in which ODA is provided, that is through a shift to grant-based ODA, and again also through transparent accounting of ODA commitments. However, the most important point...
sorry, Stephanie, if I may ask you to please just have one more minute to wrap up. Thank you. Sorry about that. I know you were patiently waiting for us. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So the most important point, of course, is here, though, to focus efforts very, very strongly on comprehensive, fair and effective sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms. That will move away from what has been a decade-old creditor bias and austerity focus in terms of policy conditionality. That is a move away from a policy mentality that condemns entire debtor countries to the equivalent of Dickensian debt prisons, rather than enabling them to leverage external debt for development. This has been raised previously as well. But in our view, that needs to include work on alternative debt sustainability framework, since these are, of course, essential to determine what amount of debt relief is required. And I can say that UNCTAD certainly is working and progressing on this considerably. We know about the limitations of the common framework in this regard that can serve as a stepping stone, but it needs to overcome those limitations in terms of country eligibility, creditor involvement, and policy conditionalities that are the standard austerity policy conditionalities. And this, of course, is something that cannot just happen at the level of the G20, but should be widened to include all concerned countries, and probably should also be something based at the UN for this reason. Now, of course, wider reforms of the international financial and tax architecture are needed, not only of the debt architectures, concerning credit rating agencies, and concerning not necessarily, I would argue, de-risking of private investment, but appropriate risk sharing that takes account of long-term development finance requirements. That would concern multilateral tax regimes, the IMF surcharges that have been mentioned, and of course also a reform the allocation of special drawing rights. That's an issue we can't go into here, but that is of course also very important from the perspective of addressing US dollar dominance in the international global system. All of that, of course, presupposes that there's strong support for a much strengthened voice of public institutions, public initiatives in these debates, and in particular an institutionalized and powerful voice for developing countries, based in the context of debt issues in particular on efforts, concrete efforts, institutional, organizational efforts for debtor coordination to face similar problems in solidarity. Now, I'll close then by just emphasizing to you that UNCTAD, of course, has special mandates to address development issues in Africa, specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa, alongside many other mandates, and it is dedicated to working with African governments and their concern, as much as it is also dedicated to working and continuing our close collaboration with civil society organizations.
We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the